The recording studio on Kepler 7 space station was quiet, except for the soft hum of equipment waiting to capture every word. Commander Zathara sat in the chair designed for his species with his 4 eyes reflecting the dim blue lights overhead. Across from him sat Kira Sullivan, a young human journalist who had traveled 3 months to reach this neutral station, just to hear what the old warrior had to say. Her hands moved nervously over the neural recorder as she prepared to ask the question that beings from dozens of worlds wanted answered. Kira took a breath and spoke clearly. What made fighting humans different from any other species in the war? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Zathara's mandibles clicked slowly, a sound that meant he was thinking deeply about something that still troubled him after all these years. He did not answer right away because the memories were heavy and dark, and they still visited him in his sleep cycles. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the translator with an edge that made Kira lean forward without realizing it. He did not start with the massive fleet battles or the desperate last stands that everyone expected to hear about first. Instead, he began with a simple encounter in a place called Titan's Belt, a mining region near one of humanity's outer colonies where asteroids drifted in the darkness like ancient sleeping giants. Zathara had been younger then, newly promoted to command rank and eager to prove himself worthy of the honor his people had given him. The Vorian fleet numbered 300 warships of various sizes, all of them gleaming with fresh paint and confidence. Their mission seemed almost too easy to be real. They were ordered to eliminate a human supply depot that was defended by exactly 1 frigate, a small vessel called the Defiant under the command of a human named Captain Greg Morrison. The mathematics were simple and clear. 300 ships against 1 meant certain victory, or so every commander in the Vorian fleet believed. Every species they had fought before understood this basic truth of warfare. When faced with impossible odds, surrender was the logical choice. Surrender meant survival, and survival meant you could fight another day when the odds were better. This was how civilized beings conducted war. But Captain Morrison did not seem to understand these simple rules. When the Vorian fleet arrived and sent the standard message demanding immediate surrender, Morrison's response came back within seconds. It was only 4 words long. Come and take it. Those 4 words would haunt Zathara for the rest of his life, because they represented something his people had never encountered before, something that made no logical sense but turned out to be more powerful than logic itself. The Defiant did not run. It did not hide. It did not surrender. Instead, this single human frigate with its crew of 72 souls attacked an entire fleet alone. Zathara watched from his command cruiser as Morrison used the asteroid field, like it was an extension of his own body. The human captain knew every rock, every debris field, every gravitational current in that region of space. He flew his ship through gaps that Vorian sensors said were too narrow. He hid behind asteroids and appeared where logic said he could not be. For 6 hours the battle raged. Morrison lured Vorian destroyers into collision courses with asteroids by appearing to be disabled when he was not. He used debris as shields, positioning his ship so that incoming fire would hit ancient space junk instead of his hull. He fired torpedoes with such perfect timing that larger Vorian ships accidentally destroyed their own escort vessels while trying to shoot down the missiles. Every time the Vorian fleet thought they had Morrison cornered, the Defiant would slip away like water through grasping fingers. The human captain targeted engines instead of weapon systems, leaving damaged Vorian ships drifting helplessly in the asteroid field where they became obstacles for their own fleet. He targeted sensor arrays, blinding command ships. He even managed to hack into Vorian communication frequencies and send false orders that caused confusion across the entire fleet. Zathara remembered the growing frustration among his fellow commanders as the hours passed. How could one small ship cause such chaos? How could a crew of barely 70 humans hold off 300 ships crewed by thousands of trained Vorian warriors? The answer, Zathara would learn, was that humans did not think about battles the same way everyone else did. When the Defiant finally fell after those 6 brutal hours, its hull breached in 17 places and its reactor critical, Morrison sent one final transmission. He thanked his crew for their service. He told them they had given their colonies 3 more weeks to prepare defenses. He said their families would know they died protecting something bigger than themselves. Then the reactor went critical, and the Defiant became a brief new star in the darkness. The count came in slowly as damage reports filtered through the Vorian fleet. 43 ships destroyed completely. 18 more so heavily damaged they had to be abandoned. Over 2,000 Vorian soldiers dead. Hundreds more injured. And all of this caused by one small frigate and 72 humans who refused to accept that mathematics meant anything when their homes were threatened. The Vorian fleet had won, technically. The supply depot was destroyed. The mission was accomplished. But it took 3 weeks longer than planned because the fleet needed repairs and time to reorganize. In those 3 weeks, human reinforcements arrived and fortified the entire sector. What should have been an easy conquest became a grinding campaign that cost the Vorians thousands more lives over the following months. Zathara paused in his telling and his 4 eyes dimmed slightly. Kira stayed silent, sensing that the old commander needed a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost gentle despite the mechanical translation. "That was when I first understood," he said. "Humans don't fight to win individual battles. They fight to make you pay in blood for every meter of space, every second of time. They turn losses into weapons. Captain Morrison knew he could not win, but he also knew his death could buy time, and time was worth more than his life in the greater picture of the war." Kira felt her skin prickle with something like cold electricity. She had grown up hearing stories of human victories, tales of brave captains and impossible odds overcome, but she had never heard them told this way. Never with such grim admiration from someone who had been on the other side. She glanced at her recorder and saw it was capturing everything. The interview had barely begun, and already she knew this would change how people understood the war. This was not propaganda or glory tales. This was truth from someone who had no reason to lie, who had fought against humanity and learned terrible lessons that still shaped him 50 years later. Zathara shifted in his seat, and his mandibles clicked again. There was more to tell, so much more, and Kira prepared herself to hear it all. The story of Captain Morrison and the Defiant was just the beginning, just the first lesson in a long and bloody education about what it meant to fight humans. She nodded at the old warrior, signaling she was ready to continue, ready to hear whatever chilling tales he needed to share. Zathara's second tale took them to a place called Terra Nova, humanity's second largest colony world where 8 million people had built lives under alien suns. The planet was beautiful from orbit, covered in blue oceans and green continents that reminded many species of Earth itself. That beauty made what happened there even harder for Zathara to talk about. Even after 50 years of trying to process the memories, the Vorian High Command had made what they thought was a brilliant strategic decision. If they could capture Terra Nova quickly and hold it, human morale would shatter. Citizens would pressure their government to surrender, rather than see more colonies fall. It was the kind of logical thinking that worked against every other species. But the Vorians were about to learn another painful lesson about human logic. The invasion force was massive by anyone's standards. 2 million coalition troops from 6 different species, all of them trained and equipped for planetary assault. They had orbital bombardment platforms that could level cities from space. They had siege equipment designed to crack open the strongest bunkers. They had intelligence reports showing Terra Nova's military garrison numbered only 300,000 soldiers, under a general named Patricia Hayes. "We were fools," Zathara said quietly, and his translator struggled to carry the weight of bitterness in those words. The old commander's eyes dimmed and brightened in sequence, which Kira had learned was how his species showed they were remembering something painful. "We counted soldiers, but we did not count the 8 million civilians. And we did not understand that on human worlds there is no real difference between the two. The coalition forces landed in the agricultural zones first, expecting to find farmers who would flee or surrender when faced with armed soldiers. Instead, they found farmers driving massive harvesting machines that had been covered with armor plating and equipped with weapons. These civilians who had never fought in a war before had turned their farming equipment into improvised combat vehicles. They fought with the desperation of people protecting their homes, and they fought with intimate knowledge of every field and irrigation ditch and storage barn in the region. Zathara had commanded a battalion tasked with securing a city called New Providence. His forces outnumbered the defenders 3-1. They had better weapons, better armor, better training. The battle should have lasted 3 days at most, according to every military textbook ever written. It lasted 4 months. And by the end of it, Zathara barely recognized himself in the mirror. Every building was a fortress, he said, and now his voice had taken on a hollow quality that made Kira want to reach out and comfort him, even though he had been the invader. Every street was a killing ground. Humans fought from sewers that ran under the city like veins. They fought from rooftops where they could see approaching troops. They fought from basements that had been turned into bunkers connected by tunnels we did not know existed. The civilians of New Providence used their knowledge of the city itself as a weapon. Teachers who had spent years educating children now coordinated evacuation routes while simultaneously feeding tactical information to military units. Engineers who had built the city's infrastructure knew exactly which buildings could be rigged to collapse and which bridges could be destroyed to slow coalition advances. Doctors and nurses treated wounded soldiers and civilians alike in hospitals that somehow kept functioning even as the battle raged around them. Zethara described an incident that still visited him in nightmares. His troops had been pursuing a group of human soldiers through what appeared to be an abandoned shopping complex. The building was large and maze-like with multiple levels and hundreds of small stores. His battalion entered carefully, using proper tactical formations, watching for ambushes. Everything seemed clear. The humans appeared to have fled deeper into the structure. Then the entire building came down. The humans had spent 2 full weeks rigging every support column and load-bearing wall with explosives. They had been waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for enough coalition troops to enter the trap. The commander who triggered the demolition was a lieutenant named Danny Foster. He and his team of 15 soldiers were inside the building when it fell. They died instantly, buried under thousands of tons of concrete and steel, but they took 300 coalition soldiers with them. Before the explosion, Foster had transmitted a message back to his command. Just 2 words, worth it. Those 2 words haunted Zethara almost as much as Captain Morrison's 4 had. They represented a mindset that was completely alien to the Vorians. This idea that trading your life could be worthwhile if the trade was favorable in the larger picture. What broke the coalition forces was not the military casualties, heavy as they were. What broke them was the psychological weight of occupying a population that refused to be occupied. Children would spit at coalition soldiers in the streets. Old humans, some of them barely able to walk, would rather die than accept medical treatment from their captors. People who had been teachers and shopkeepers, and artists before the war now, looked at coalition soldiers with such pure hatred that it became difficult to patrol the streets. The Vorians were not naturally cruel people. Most of them had joined the military out of duty or tradition, not bloodlust. Having civilians hate them, having children fear them, having elderly people choose death over their help wore down even the most disciplined troops. Morale collapsed. Soldiers began to question why they were there. Some refused orders. A few even deserted, choosing punishment over continuing to fight. General Hayes had been fighting a defensive campaign, using every tactic she could to slow the coalition advance. But 4 months into the occupation, she saw her opportunity. Coalition forces were spread thin, trying to control the entire planet. Their supply lines were stretched. Their soldiers were exhausted and demoralized. Hayes launched a counteroffensive that caught the coalition completely by surprise. Human forces that had been hiding in the wilderness emerged. Civilian resistance groups coordinated with military units in ways that seemed impossible to the coalition commanders. The orbital bombardment platforms were sabotaged by infiltrators who should not have been able to reach them. Within 2 weeks, the coalition position on Terra Nova had collapsed completely. Of the 2 million soldiers who landed on Terra Nova, barely 800,000 made it back to their ships. The rest were dead, captured, or had deserted. Zethara's battalion, which had numbered 1,500 troops when they landed, limped back to orbit with fewer than 200 survivors. 90% casualties. The number still made him feel sick when he thought about it. Humans taught us something critical that day, Zethara said, and he looked directly at Kira with all 4 of his eyes focused intensely. You cannot conquer a people who refuse to be conquered. Every human becomes a soldier when their home is threatened. Age does not matter. Prior military training does not matter. When you invade a human world, you are not fighting an army. You are fighting an entire civilization. Kira's recorder captured every word, but she barely noticed. She was lost in the story, imagining what it must have been like on both sides of that terrible battle. The humans fighting for their homes with everything they had. The coalition soldiers realizing too late that they had walked into a nightmare from which there was no easy escape. The studio felt colder somehow as Zethara finished his tale of Terra Nova. Outside the window, Kira could see humans and Vorians working together on the station. Former enemies, now colleagues and even friends. It seemed impossible that these same two species had once tried to destroy each other. Zathara had asked for a short break before continuing, and Kira noticed how the old warrior seemed to age before her eyes when speaking of these memories. When they resumed, something had changed in his voice. It carried a different quality now, something that mixed horror and respect in equal measure, as if he was about to tell her about something so terrible that language barely had words for it. Station Omega had been humanity's last major military installation in the Outer Rim. From that massive starbase, human forces coordinated defense operations across 70 different star systems. It was the anchor point for everything that stood between Earth's colonies and total conquest. The Coalition leadership understood this perfectly. If Station Omega fell, the war would effectively be over. Human colonies would be defenseless. Surrender would be the only logical option left. So the Coalition assembled the greatest fleet anyone had ever seen, 4,000 warships from all 6 member species of the Alliance, massive dreadnoughts that could crack planets, fast attack cruisers that could run down any fleeing vessel, carrier ships holding thousands of fighters, and leading them all was the Vorian Pride, a dreadnought called Endless Night that was considered invincible by every military analyst who had studied it. Zathara had been promoted by this point in the war. He commanded a cruiser in the forward battle group, and he watched from his bridge as that massive armada gathered in the darkness of space. "We knew we had won before the first shot was fired," he said, and there was no pride in his voice now, only a kind of tired sadness. "Our intelligence told us the station had supplies for 6 months. We came prepared to wait them out for a year if necessary. The mathematics could not have been clearer. They had 1,200 ships. We had 4,000. Simple numbers said we would win. What the Coalition did not know was that Admiral Kevin Grant, the human commander of Station Omega, had no intention of enduring a siege. He had studied every battle of the war. He had read reports about Captain Morrison and the Defiant. He had analyzed what happened on Terra Nova. Grant understood something that the Coalition did not. Humans fought best when they had nothing left to lose. The battle began with a move that shocked every Coalition commander. Grant threw his entire fleet at them in what appeared to be a suicidal charge. 1,200 human ships accelerated toward 4,000 Coalition vessels with their weapons blazing. It made no tactical sense. It violated every principle of defensive warfare. The Coalition commanders thought Grant had gone insane. Zathara watched from his cruiser as the space between the two fleets filled with fire and death. Human ships that were heavily damaged and venting atmosphere into space did not retreat to regroup. Instead, they accelerated harder, ramming into Coalition vessels with everything they had left. Fighter pilots whose craft were too damaged to return to the station aimed for enemy bombers and collided with them deliberately. Even unarmed supply ships became weapons, their cargo holds packed with explosives and set on collision courses with Coalition capital ships. The old commander's voice dropped even lower as he described what came next. A human medical frigate, clearly marked with the red crosses that meant it carried wounded personnel, broadcast a distress signal. The Coalition fleet commander, following the rules of civilized warfare, ordered his ships to spare it and provide assistance. But when Coalition vessels moved in to help, they discovered there were no wounded aboard. The frigate carried only volunteers who had known exactly what they were signing up for. When Coalition ships surrounded it, the humans detonated their reactor core. The blast destroyed 18 Coalition ships immediately. 40 more were damaged so badly they had to withdraw from the battle. And the message was clear to everyone watching. Humans would use anything and everything as a weapon, even things that should have been sacred like medical vessels. There were no rules they would not break, no lines they would not cross when fighting for their survival. The battle raged for 3 days. Human ships fought with a ferocity that seemed impossible to sustain. They took damage that should have forced them to surrender and kept fighting. They lost shields and weapons and life support, and still they came forward. By the end of the 3rd day, Admiral Grant's fleet was gone. Every single ship had been destroyed or damaged beyond any hope of repair. The station itself was burning, its shields collapsed, its weapons silent, its corridors filled with smoke and death. Zathara's fleet moved in for the final assault. Coalition Marines prepared to board what was left of the station and capture any survivors. They expected resistance, but they also expected surrender once the humans realized there was no hope left. That was when Admiral Grant made his final transmission, broadcast across all frequencies so that everyone in both fleets could hear it. "You want our station?" Grant said calmly, as if he was commenting on the weather rather than facing his own death. "Come claim it." Then Station Omega exploded. Grant had spent the entire 3-day battle evacuating non-essential personnel on stealth ships while his engineers rigged the massive installation with every explosive they could manufacture or salvage from destroyed vessels. The detonation was so powerful it could be seen from 6 light minutes away, a miniature sun blooming in the darkness of space like a flower made of fire. The shockwave caught the Coalition fleet while they were bunched together in boarding formation. Ships that survived the initial blast were caught by the debris field that followed. Fragments of the station, accelerated to incredible speeds by the explosion, became projectiles that tore through hulls like paper. Zathara's cruiser lost its entire port side. The ship next to his was split in half. Everywhere he looked, Coalition vessels were dying. The endless night, that invincible dreadnought that was supposed to guarantee Coalition victory, took a piece of debris the size of a small building directly through its reactor section. The pride of the Vorian fleet had to be abandoned and scuttled. Of the 4,000 Coalition ships that attacked Station Omega, fewer than 2,000 limped away. Half the fleet gone in a single moment. And the worst part was that it had not been a battle. It had been a trap that the Coalition had walked into willingly. Admiral Grant died with his station, along with 3,000 personnel who had volunteered to stay behind. They had no hope of survival, no chance of rescue, no possibility of victory in any traditional sense. But in their death, they eliminated half of the Coalition's offensive capability. They turned the tide of the war. They made it possible for humanity to survive. Zathara's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. "Humans understand something we did not," he said, and his translator barely managed to process the complex emotions in his voice. "Victory is not about who survives. It is about who is still standing when the smoke clears. They are willing to pay any price, make any sacrifice, because they fight for something beyond themselves. They fight for the people who come after them, for children who are not born yet, for a future they will never see. That makes them more dangerous than any weapon." Kira felt chills running down her spine. She had known about Station Omega, of course. Every human child learned about Admiral Grant's last stand in school. But hearing it from this perspective, from someone who had been there on the other side, made it real in a way that history books never could. She understood now why Zathara had agreed to this interview. These were not stories meant to glorify war. They were warnings about the true cost of conflict. After 3 years of brutal warfare that had cost millions of lives on both sides, the Coalition began to fracture. Zathara's fourth tale revealed the moment when everything changed, when humanity stopped merely surviving and started winning. The transition was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but once it began, there was no stopping it. The human counteroffensive began at Proxima Centauri, humanity's oldest extrasolar colony, and the first star system humans had ever reached beyond their own sun. The Coalition had held Proxima for 18 months, using it as a staging ground for raids that pushed deeper into human territory. For the Coalition, it represented victory and momentum. For humans, it represented something taken that needed to be reclaimed, no matter the cost. Vice Admiral Lisa Turner was given command of the human fleet tasked with retaking Proxima. She had 800 warships, most of them rebuilt from salvaged vessels and new construction that still smelled of fresh welding and paint. It was not a large fleet by the standards of the war. The Coalition defending Proxima had nearly 1,200 ships under Zathara's command. He had been promoted to fleet commander after surviving Station Omega, one of the few senior officers who had lived through that nightmare. Zathara held every advantage that military doctrine said mattered. Superior numbers, defensive positions that had been fortified for 18 months, detailed knowledge of the system's geography, and supply lines that stretched weeks instead of months. He was confident, perhaps too confident because he had spent 3 years watching humans fight desperately. He had never seen them fight with hope, and hope changed everything. Admiral Turner's strategy was unlike anything the Coalition had encountered before. She did not mass her fleet for a single overwhelming assault the way Grant had at Station Omega. She did not try to match the Coalition ship for ship in grinding attrition warfare. Instead, she divided her forces into multiple task groups that struck simultaneously across the entire system, forcing Zathara to split his attention and his fleet. One group led by Captain Nicole Harper assaulted the Coalition's primary shipyard in a frontal attack that drew Zathara's main fleet like moths to flame. While they fought, another force under Commander Jake Peterson infiltrated the system through an asteroid field that previous surveys had marked as impassable. Peterson's ships appeared behind Coalition supply depots and destroyed them methodically, while the main battle raged elsewhere. But the most brilliant part of Turner's plan was a third group commanded by Captain Andrew Cole. His ships did not engage in combat at all. Instead, they broadcast messages toward Coalition positions, humanitarian transmissions that detailed casualty figures, and questioned whether the promises of quick victory had been worth the mounting losses. The messages were aimed at Coalition member species, particularly the Threxians and Kelvorians, whose governments had told their populations this would be a simple conquest. That was brilliant and cruel in equal measure, Zathara said, and there was something like admiration in his voice despite the pain of remembering. We Vorians have strong cultural concepts of honor and duty. We can endure losses because we believe in the cause. But some of our Coalition partners joined this war for profit or territory or simple opportunism. Their populations had been promised victory without significant cost. When they learned the truth, when they saw the casualty lists and realized this war could drag on for years more, their support began to crack. The battle for Proxima lasted 2 weeks. Zathara's forces technically inflicted heavier casualties on the attackers. Nearly 500 of Turner's 800 ships were destroyed or too damaged to continue fighting. By the cold mathematics of warfare, the Coalition had won. But mathematics did not tell the whole story anymore. The humans achieved their objectives. They retook Proxima's orbital infrastructure. They established a beachhead that could not be removed without committing resources the Coalition no longer possessed. More importantly, something happened that no one had anticipated. Within a month of the battle, 3 Coalition member species announced their withdrawal from the war. The Threxians and Kelvorians went first, their governments unable to withstand domestic pressure to end a conflict that was costing far more than anyone had been told. The Pendril followed shortly after, citing economic concerns and questioning whether continuing the war served their interests. The alliance that had seemed unbreakable was fracturing. Species that had eagerly joined when victory looked certain now sought peace treaties with humanity. Captain Cole's broadcast had done something that military force alone could not. They had made Coalition populations question their leaders. They had introduced doubt where there had been certainty. They had turned a military conflict into a political one. Admiral Turner taught us that humans fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, Zathara explained. They fight with weapons, yes, but also with words, with ideas, with truth and doubt and information. They made us question whether victory was possible, whether it was worth the cost, whether our governments had been honest with us. That kind of warfare is more devastating than any weapon because it attacks the will to fight itself. The war continued for another 2 years after Proxima, but that battle marked the true turning point. Human fleets that had learned from 3 years of defensive warfare began reclaiming lost territory system by system. Each victory cost them dearly, but humans seemed to possess an inexhaustible reservoir of will. They had learned to accept losses. They had learned to fight efficiently. Most importantly, they had learned to win. Zathara participated in 4 more major engagements after Proxima, each one a defeat that felt more inevitable than the last. He watched the Coalition fleet shrink from thousands of vessels to hundreds, then to dozens. He watched former allies sue for peace and withdraw their forces. He watched his own government struggle to maintain morale as the casualty lists grew longer and longer. The Vorians, who had led the Coalition from the beginning, found themselves fighting almost alone by the end. Other species had abandoned them or switched sides completely. Supply lines collapsed. Recruitment failed to replace losses. Political pressure mounted at home. And still the humans came forward, reclaiming their colonies one by one, pushing the Vorians back toward their own territory. We realized too late that we had made a fundamental error in our thinking, Zathara said, and his 4 eyes dimmed with something that looked like shame. We thought we were fighting a war of conquest, a limited conflict with specific objectives and rational goals. But humans were fighting a war of survival. An existential struggle where the only options were victory or extinction, and a species fighting for its very existence cannot be defeated, only destroyed completely. None of us had the stomach for genocide, so we had already lost the moment we started this war. The old commander fell silent for a long moment. Kira could see he was exhausted, not physically but emotionally, drained by reliving these memories that he had carried for 50 years. She wanted to tell him they could stop, that he had shared enough, but she also knew he needed to finish the story. He had come too far to leave it incomplete. Zathara looked at her with all four eyes, and something in his expression made Kira's breath catch. There was sadness there, yes, but also a kind of peace. He had survived when so many had not. He had learned lessons written in blood and fire, and now he was passing those lessons on, making sure future generations understood what war truly cost and why peace was worth almost any price to maintain. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now rather than awkward. Outside the studio, the station continued its endless orbit, carrying people from dozens of species who worked together and lived together, and had mostly forgotten that they had once tried to destroy each other. That forgetting was both a blessing and a danger, which was exactly why Zathara was here telling these stories. The final session found Zathara more contemplative than he had been during their previous conversations. Kira noticed that the old warrior had brought something with him this time, a small object that he kept turning over in his hands while they sat in silence preparing to begin. She did not ask about it yet, sensing that whatever it was would be revealed when the time was right. The great galactic conflict did not end with a dramatic final battle or a glorious last stand. It ended slowly, gradually, like a fire burning itself out when there was nothing left to consume. One by one, coalition member species sued for peace. Governments fell as populations demanded an end to the bloodshed. Military commanders resigned rather than continue ordering soldiers into battles they knew could not be won. The Vorians, who had led the coalition from the very beginning, were the last to surrender, 5 full years after the war had started. The peace negotiations were held on neutral ground aboard a station provided by species that had remained wisely uninvolved throughout the conflict. Zathara attended as a military advisor, one of the few senior Vorian commanders who had survived the entire war. It was strange to walk through corridors alongside humans, to share meals in the same dining facilities, to sit in conference rooms discussing terms of peace with beings he had spent 5 years trying to kill. I expected them to be monsters, Zathara confessed, and his voice carried a weight of shame at his own previous blindness. After years of fighting, after watching them sacrifice themselves with what seemed like casual indifference to death, I thought they must be inherently violent creatures, naturally destructive beings who found joy in warfare. I could not understand how else they could fight the way they did. But the humans he met during those negotiations were not monsters at all. They were tired, deeply tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. They were grieving for friends and family lost, for homes destroyed, for years of life consumed by war. But they were also remarkably willing to forgive, surprisingly ready to move past the hatred that 5 years of conflict should have created. The human delegation was led by Secretary of Peace Operations Rachel Morrison, who Zathara learned was the daughter of Captain Greg Morrison, the man who had commanded the Defiant in that first battle so long ago. Secretary Morrison approached the negotiations not with vengeance in her heart, but with cold pragmatism in her mind. She understood that punitive peace terms would only plant the seeds for future conflicts. She understood that humiliated enemies became dangerous enemies. She understood something that shocked every coalition delegate present. Humans did not want to destroy the species that had attacked them. They wanted to build something better from the ashes of war. Zathara remembered one particular moment that crystallized everything for him. During a break in negotiations, Secretary Morrison approached him directly. She had learned he commanded the fleet at Proxima. He expected accusations or anger or at minimum cold professional distance. Instead, she thanked him for being a worthy adversary. She told him that humans honored courage even in their enemies, that respect was not diminished by being on opposite sides of a conflict. Then she gave him something. Zathara held up the small object he had been turning over in his hands throughout the interview. It was a medal, human in design, with an inscription that Kira could now see read Lieutenant Chris Turner, Station Omega, died serving something greater than himself. Secretary Morrison's son had died in that terrible explosion, one of 3,000 volunteers who stayed behind to rig the station for detonation. She gave Zathara her son's medal and told him she hoped that in peace they could learn from each other what they failed to understand in war. The old commander's 4 eyes dimmed with emotion as he continued. I could not speak at first. The gesture was so unexpected, so impossibly generous that I had no words. Then I told her about my own offspring, 3 younglings who I had feared would grow up without a father, who had sent me messages throughout the war begging me to come home safely. I told her that humans had taught me the true cost of war, that every casualty was not just a number, but a person with family and friends and dreams. I told her I would spend the rest of my life making sure young Vorians understood that cost before they ever considered starting another conflict. The peace terms that emerged from those negotiations were surprisingly lenient. No occupation forces, no reparations that would cripple coalition economies, no war crime tribunals that would drag the conflict on for decades in courtrooms. Instead, humans proposed mutual defense pacts, technology exchanges, and cultural programs designed to prevent future misunderstandings. They confused us again, Zathara said with something that might have been a laugh if his species had possessed that ability. We thought they would demand tribute, territory submission. Instead, they offered partnership. It was perhaps their most brilliant strategic move, because by being generous in victory, they turned former enemies into allies. 50 years had passed since the peace was signed. In that time, Vorian and human children had grown up together on joint colony worlds. The 2 species had combined their technologies in ways that benefited both. They had shared their cultures, their art, their music, their philosophies. The coalition that once fought humanity now stood alongside them as partners in exploring the galaxy. Young beings from both species who had never experienced the war sometimes struggled to understand why it had happened at all. That was exactly why Zathara was here, why he had agreed to this interview, despite the pain of reliving these memories. Young people needed to understand. They needed to hear these stories not as glorified tales of heroism, but as stark reminders of what war truly cost. They needed to know that every battle, every victory, every defeat was written in blood and measured in lives that could never be recovered. Kira had one final question for him. After everything he had seen and experienced, what was the most important lesson humans taught the galaxy? Zathara was quiet for a long moment, his 4 eyes dimming and brightening in sequence as he thought carefully about how to answer. Humans taught us that strength is not measured in ships or weapons or even courage. Though they possess all of these in abundance, he finally said, true strength comes from fighting for something greater than yourself. Every human who died in that war believed their sacrifice meant something, that it protected those who came after them. That belief, that willingness to give everything for others, made them unbeatable in a way that superior numbers or technology never could. But they also taught us mercy, he continued. They could have destroyed us after the war. They had the power, the justification, and certainly the anger. Instead, they chose to build bridges. They understood that true victory is not the destruction of your enemy, but the transformation of your enemy into a friend. That wisdom, more than any weapon or tactic, is why humans survived when we thought they could not. Zathara stood slowly, his tall frame unfolding to its full height. 50 years have passed and the galaxy is at peace. Vorian and human children play together. We share our meals and our dreams and our hopes for the future. The coalition that fought humanity now stands beside them as equal partners. This is the real victory, not what happened during the war, but what we built together after it ended. He looked at Kira with all 4 eyes focused intensely. Tell your readers this, he said. Tell them that war reveals the truth of who we are. Humans, when faced with extinction, showed the galaxy not just their strength but their humanity. They fought like demons when they had to, but they forgave like angels when they could. That is the true story worth remembering. That is why we honor both those who fell and those who survived. That is why we must never forget. With those words, the old warrior departed, leaving Kira alone with her recordings and the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She knew this story would change how people understood the war. It was not just a tale of battles won and lost, but a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit even in the darkest of times. She began to write, determined to share these chilling tales with the galaxy so that future generations would remember not just the cost of war, but the price of peace and the courage required to choose one over the other.